the Engineering Roundtable. I'm Jim Anderton, Multimedia Content Director here at engineering.com. You know, all modern devices from interplanetary spacecraft to auto infotainment systems have one important attribute in common, and that is they must interact with a human user. And that human-machine interface is far more than an afterthought in new product development. In consumer goods particularly, user satisfaction and ultimately the marketability of product features and benefits depends on how easily and ideally seamlessly users can make software-driven devices perform. Now, developing a great HMI is an art, a science, and it's an engineering challenge, especially when, as happens commonly, HMI development becomes a pacing factor in overall product development. Now, getting this part of a project under control requires a sensible engineering approach to the problem and the right tools. Joining me to discuss this important issue are Henning Lin, Director of Solutions Engineering for Unity, Romano McBride, Senior Technical Product Manager for Unity, Paul Schouten, Design Team Lead at TomTom, and Rock Eryavich, Vice President of Engineering at TomTom. Henning, Romano, Paul, and Rock, welcome to the Roundtable. And I'm going to dive right in because this subject is important and there's just so much to talk about. Henning, but as we kick off, could we define HMI for the purposes of this discussion? A lot of things could be human, a toggle switch could be human-machine interface, but what do we mean when we talk about an HMI here?
Well, as you phrased it already in your introduction, HMI stands for human-machine interface. So it's as the name says, the way how a human being is interacting with a machine or with a product, right? That could be a hardware interface, as you said, a toggle, a knob, a lever, something like that. But in more modern products, we see that mostly as a digital interface, as you know it from your smartphone, which could be a screen, could be more than that. I think it connects also to the aspect of the UX, the user experience, but it is. And maybe we can discuss this in the group, but I think it's a subset of that. As user experience also includes the hardware design, the HMI is embedded into, and the overall user journey and experience it has with the product. Yeah.
Rock, at TomTom, you develop a very famous, well-known software-driven service, and of course we all need to get where we're going and know how to get where we're going. That's sort of a unique user challenge, isn't it? I mean, it's not like selecting the frequency on a radio. It's what is that challenge from your perspective in making something that's easy to use but highly functional at the same time?
Well, it's a complexity of interactions, right? There are in a navigation service, we are really talking about multiple competing functionalities that add up to that experience for the user, right? From finding a route to your destination, for searching at the destination, for actually navigating and browsing for a destination. All of these have to play nicely together to form that cohesive experience. And if any one of them fails, user will perceive that as a not very great experience and potentially a bad interface as well. So yeah, the complexity is in this interplay of different functionalities, and all of that has to then play nicely with the actual user interface design, and if it involves hardware, even with the hardware components of that design, the HMI itself. So yeah, it's an intersection of many different technologies and design principles that comes into play.
Yeah. Now you mentioned it's hardware, it's software. Paul, maybe I'll throw this to you. It's in the automotive sphere in particular. It's to a certain extent aviation too. You have OEMs. You have perhaps a tier one supplier community, which is feeding technology to those OEMs, and you've got a software overlay, which may be from another vendor altogether. And it's historically, OEMs have wanted to own the entire ecosystem completely. They wanted, from the customer-facing perspective, they want to be the sole source vendor for all of this. And we saw that break down a little bit where we saw people like Microsoft, for example, or Apple beginning to put branded sort of services into OEM products down there. Is OEM brand ownership really important with HMIs, or do you think the customer, does the end user really care at this point if it's software as a service or it's a third party?
I think they care. I think in the end they buy a car, and it's like a lot of emotion goes into that purchase. It's a big sum of money you're putting down, right? And if you want to, like, a beautiful car is like it's holistically designed, right? So that interface that sits there should also kind of like be part of that. It should feel part of the interior, if I may. And also the whole journey, as also Rock mentioned, like from end to end. It starts when searching for something, but also throughout the journey, driving with it, and arriving at your destination. It should all feel holistically. And I think that user experience, right? What Henning also mentioned is it's not just the HMI, it's the whole experience you have in a car. If you can design it end to end, fully holistically, that is the best user experience. And I think that's why that brand plays a big role in that design of the full car.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because in HMIs we're sort of in a soft area, or a gray zone in a sense, because we're trying to create a user experience, but an auto manufacturer is trying to make a hard device and to sell that for cash at the same time. So between Romano, let me throw this one up to you: is that it's biggest challenges in the HMI development process, because we're talking about getting to an end goal of a really usable HMI, but from an engineering perspective, of course, the problem is how do you get there? So if you're a hardware focused individual, and my history in automotive, well, we were very hardware focused. It was all about an infotainment system. Was all about how many cubic centimeters of volume do we have? How much mass do we have? How do we bolt it into the dashboard? This is a whole new world. Well, I mean, how do you get there?
Well, if you look at the recent history of HMI, automakers have tried to incorporate new technologies into like their products, but they were very resistant doing the same for processes. So in a way, for a while, what you've been getting is kind of the worst of two worlds, right? You get like the new technology with all the touch screens and anything that might or might not be distracting, but you buy that car and then that's just it. There was no over-the-air updates until like a few years ago with most major OEMs. And the development processes were very rigid. So car makers basically applied the same logic and the same processes to what they would do for hardware. So they would, years in advance, plan exactly what their system would look like, what each button would do, what each screen would look like, down to the individual pixel, create a specification, and then send that specification over to a supplier that will then build this. Now, the problem with that, of course, is user experience is something that is not, it's not perfect like in engineering. It's not like the brake either works or not, or you reach this temperature or not, right? You have to like understand the cycle where you get feedback from users, you understand the market, you improve your product. And this is why it's important that automakers not only incorporate new technologies for graphics and like new hardware and everything and touchscreens and all these things, but also change their processes to something that's more like what like consumer electronics companies do, that constantly improve the user experience of their products.
Yeah. Yeah. Rock, let me ask you this question. In the hardware-driven automotive world that I come from, very frequently the OEM customer would make a request for a functionality which either couldn't be delivered at the price point that the customer wanted, or there was an alternate way to deliver that same functionality that was more efficient, lower cost, or higher quality. And it required some negotiation back and forth between our engineering teams and the customer engineering teams. And there were times when that trading, that negotiation back and forth, it could be quite heated at times. There could be some quite acrimonious meetings at this point. You know, it was a little bit of metaphorical fist pounding on the table. But at the end, always within the time and cost constraints, we negotiated our way to a sort of a happy sort of truce, you know, a demarcation line that worked out well. Is that you're working in a software world at this point where you're not implementing something that physically bolts into the chassis? Essentially, you're delivering something ethereal. Is that process the same in the way you interact with OEMs? Is that kind of horse trading we're talking about?
It still exists, of course, because while we don't have the fixed hardware, well, we don't have the constraints of designing hardware, we have constraints around the fact that the hardware that goes into a vehicle has certain limitations. So whatever software you will deploy to it can only do so much, right? What exactly we put in there functionality-wise will also be limited by the hardware that OEM is choosing and the allocation they're giving to us. So we are actively, even recently, I've been in meetings where we were negotiating like how much memory can we use for certain features, What does that give us? Does that satisfy the OEM requirements? Can they give us something more so they can get something fancier looking in the cockpit? It's an ongoing process, constant back and forth. And on top of that, of course, there is also like they want a feature X that can be built in this amount of time for this amount of money, but they want to do it sooner. Right? So then you again have to negotiate how to get that accelerated. Are they willing to pay more? Are they willing to wait a little bit or get it over the air with a future update? So that dynamic exists. It's a little bit more agile, I guess, in this world, and it continues after the car ships now, but it is always present.
Yeah. Henning, in typical auto development, for many aspects of the platform, we have simulation software. We have software that allows engineers to render things, and we can be reasonably certain when we design something that it's going to work, that we can deliver it within a certain cost and time constraint within reason. And very frequently, the customer wants to change. They come back and they say, we've changed our design. Basically, it's going to have ripple through effects at this point. So we need you to implement this change, and this change. And we used to have a big problem with configuration control. And one problem that was introduced by advanced development software across engineering that was not foreseen was that when we went from simple rendering to things like advanced simulation software and these sort of high-speed design tools, it's now possible to go through multiple iterations and variations of the same design. We used to, in the days of paper, when I began as a junior, we talked about a drawing going through the alphabet. So many alphabetic revisions at this point that my first engineering job, and a very common junior engineering job, was just physically rounding up all the blueprints to make sure everybody in the organization was actually working from the correct revision. And then we virtualized that, with software. So we had to basically, but to my amazement, with software-driven design, it still was a problem. You could still find a small subcontractor or vendor somewhere who was making a part to the incorrect revision. And then that created its own sort of level of complexity in here. In the software world, complexity is free. You could make literally thousands of potential changes to code, and you could, depending on how you classify those, that could be either an infinite number of revisions, or do you corral them? Is that something you negotiate with the customer? I mean, is it just something you can do within development software? How do you get control of configuration to sort of make sure that everyone's on the same page?
Well, that's a great point, and I think actually, like, if you look at HMIs at the moment, that kind of software-driven HMI is not that old yet, and I think Romano said it earlier. That transition to a more agile software development environment at the OEM and including the suppliers is just in the making, basically. So there is not a best practice maybe you could look at, but what we know as Unity, how it works in the gaming environment, and we know that there are constraints within an automotive environment, that it's not one-to-one applicable. I understand, but even if you take like app development for a smartphone and take that into consideration, that is a far more agile process of creating software and checking variants and also designs, and the cycle between elaborating design ideas and deploying that then on device to test the performance, to test the user experience. It's far more agile, and the cycles are far more more speedy than it is at what we see now at the OEMs. We believe that this has to change, and it can be changed because today, I mean, a game developer, they also have to check how does the game perform on a variety of smartphones, from early iPhone generations to latest ones to Android, whatsoever screen sizes. It's not that it doesn't have that variety maybe as if you look at the whole series of a Mercedes-Benz or others. So you have to handle that complexity, understood. But I think we with our technology, but also others together, can help transforming that process. And as Romano said it earlier, they have to embrace that change. We believe to address the user needs.
Yeah. So if I can weigh in here, I think one of the key components is breaking down those silos. So there's a lot of technological advancement in all of those departments that do parts of the design. But then if, like you said, everyone in the end prints out a blueprint and takes it to the next department, Like there's a lot of overhead, right? So this is, I think, where technology can also come in. It's not just like improving the individual's job, it's bringing them all together so everybody can work on the same thing. So that means when building HMI, instead of the designers building a prototype that's interactive and they have like a mock-up of the car and they can test it, and then they basically create a PDF of all the specifications and they send it over to engineering and then they start rebuilding it. Instead of doing that, we can just all work on the same thing. So designers will work on like a project. It doesn't have to be final, right? But it's like it's like, let's say a moving target version, like you can start with gray boxing and then you can roll it all the way into like something that looks like a prototype and can get close into production. And then engineering can take that over, and basically from day one, everybody has something that just works and that they can look at together. So the engineers and designers can sit together in the car and try the user experience, no matter what state it's in. That's not that important. Eventually, you will have to do all that work anyway to get it stable and everything, but it's about everybody being able to collaborate on the same thing.
There's one, if I might add, there's one thing that makes it a bit more complicated, because like the hardware we run on at an OEM, that is available pretty late in the process. So we have to simulate a lot of that input output, but also like performance. There are a lot of assumptions and simulated context within that design process, but also that can be done, right? I think it's doable, and some of the customers we're talking to do it in that very moment. But it's a rethinking. It's a rethinking of the process, and also like how you collaborate with your tier 1 suppliers, and a bit of giving up this. And I think Romano nailed it, like this silo thing, but also this protectionism, is this the right term, of being more transparent and so on. So
maybe if I can add on that, which I think is also indeed breaking silos, not work in isolation, right? That's something that we see happening more with the tools we have, but also the people in the car OEMs, the companies, they see that as well. So they're not thinking about the all the list of features that they want to do. It's more like a holistic view. Like, okay, we want to do this and this better. Let's break those silos, not work in isolation. Let's look at again, end to end. The hardware is important. The context is important. All these things are important. So bring all the people together as early on as possible, and then really solve that the user need or value you want to increase. And that is being adopted. That's what we're seeing. And I'm actually very happy that this is taking traction in this industry.
Sorry, if I were to add one more thing here, and this is very much analogous to, like, in game industry, we've been facing this over and over again over decades now. Like, many of us have shipped on different hardware launches that basically go through the exact same process, but at an accelerated rate, because these things happen much faster in that industry. But it is all about, like everybody has mentioned, it's breaking down the silos. So you're always looking at the cohesive picture of the end product, what you're trying to ship. I think we have right now recent experience where we have a project that we are collaborating on a common technology stack, where the OEM is working with the same tech stack as that we are, even though they were building different parts of the product, and that really helps. But the key about it is also bringing the iteration cycles speeds up, right? It's cycle times down, essentially, because like Henning said, that's how you get quality in the end. Like, it's doing many of these iterations. That's how the product quality actually improves. It's not that you design it once and it's perfect. No, you design it 100 times in small increments, and then you get the 100th iteration that is really what you wanted.
Yeah, Rock, how do you define quality? You just mentioned the notion of quality down here. If I design a bracket, I can define 4 or 5 attributes, plug them into an SPC program, pull it off, pick up a micrometer, and I can tell you whether or not I have a quality part or not. How do you define quality in software?
Okay, I'll let Paul or one of the others take this one first. I have my opinions, but they're tech-driven, so I think...
Paul, you look like you're ready to lean into this. Tell me.
A good UX. right? And measure that, right? Are people happy with it?
Yeah.
I mean, it's as simple as that. Are people, happy to use it? Are they coming back and, using your software? And a lot of things play a role there, of course. It's the usability. Is it designed properly? Do people understand it? Is it valuable? Is it actually of value to people? The whole technical part of it is it performant? Is it stable? Is it can I work with it, right? And that's has to do with the quality of the code, of the data, of course. I would, but it's look at it holistically. I'm saying this already like the whole evening, but that is in the end important.
Yeah. Henning, how much of that is dependent on the tools you use to actually make the HMI? This notion of the drive to quality of the perfect functionality.
Well, a huge part of that is just what we discussed and the iteration times, and make it a kind of what you see is what you get approach for a long streak of the development process. Another one is, like, for me, the user experience, especially for an HMI in the car, is not something that is limited to the car itself. It should also be a connected experience, something that starts outside of the car and it does not end in the car, but at your destination. And it's more like a connected experience. So I think that makes it a bit more complex, because you have more parts that have to play together. Obviously the tool stack you're building on and making also that complexity handleable and experienceable from end to end add a lot to creating that quality what we talk about. So at the end, it's about, as you said, technical requirements like response time and the typical measurable items, but it's also, like Paul said, the fun with it. It has to be fun, and it has to be efficient, and it has to be all what we know from a good app development where you use day-to-day on your smartphone.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting thought, because especially in automotive engineering, aerospace as well, is that it's a team sport, and of course it requires engineering teams to make functional assemblies and ultimately functional vehicles. But we also think of software development as very much an individual activity of brilliant young men and women who are sitting by themselves, sort of in a dark corner someplace, who are ideating and creating brilliant code, and then out it comes. And the whole ethos of the software industry has been about the loner, the brilliant individual who has a brilliant idea and suddenly just creates this code. Romano, how do those things jive at this point? I mean, is this in the software world that traditionally we think of a lot of sometimes headstrong, really brilliant people, and not much committee think. I mean, is development tools, is that one way to bridge that gap?
I mean, looking back at what Rock said about the game industry, right, that they have figured it out for a long time, I would say in HMI, we should just apply the same thing. So just to give you an example, what is done in the game industry is often at the end of the day, everybody would come together, sit on the couch and play test whatever they've hacked together that day, right? And now in HMI, recently I've seen that happening too. And that is a tremendous improvement in the processes, because at the end of the day, the designers and engineers and everyone can sit together in a car or a seating buck or whatever, a bunch of iPads taped to office chairs, whatever they have, right, that represents the current state of the project, but they can sit together and play test this thing that they're working on together and actually experience it and experience the joy that comes with that product. And this is something this is basically the only way to measure that, right? All these other things that we talked about regarding quality, right? Like, does it crash? How much memory does it use? How quickly does it start up? These things are very measurable. But the joy of it, and actually the user experience of the product, you can only really get to a good result if you can collaborate. And the game industry, because in video games it's all about the joy of it, they kind of let, like, by example here, and we're just kind of following now in HMI.
Yeah. Now, the concept of the game has come up many times in this conversation, which is very interesting. Last week, I had a 5-year-old in my car, my niece, and there's a in-dash navigation system. And then she leaned forward, looked at it, and said, "It's just like a game." Because she looked at that screen and looked at those graphics there and automatically assumed that she was looking at a video game. And to my amazement is that when I gave her access to the system, she was better at actually using it than I was, and she had never seen it before. which I thought was a very, very curious phenomenon where someone basically who does not drive, has never driven, somehow looks at the interface and actually figures out how to use it in a more effective way than I am. And I'm the individual that actually looks out the windshield and sees the real world representation of what the system is trying to show me. Is that an unusual circumstance, Rock or Paul, or are we looking at a world now where basically you're building an HMI, you're building an HMI for generations of people that maybe react to it differently?
Oh yeah, for sure. It's I mean, but the thing is, a lot of people still drive, right? And all generations. So that's also, I think, a really hard part of this, because we do have to design for all of them. You cannot say like, oh, we're just going to focus on the young kids. I think it's more like, people or every age they stay the same, so people have the same needs, etc. But indeed the adoption of new technologies is faster, is increasing with new generations. Taking that into account is definitely important. Maybe for some use case that will only be applied for newer generations, you can change it a bit. Maybe let's say you have a whole way of theming the map and putting your avatar and change it, but that's probably just going to be used by a new generation because they can find that out. But they're also interested in it, right? And that's fine. And maybe some people from an older generation will also find out about it and still enjoy it. But then that maybe is more tailored to a new generation. But I think you should always take into account all generations, because otherwise, it's going to be hard to design all different experience for different generations.
Rock?
I agree with what Paul said. Obviously, we are evolving, and the designs of the software are skewing towards generations that grew up with technology that some of us when we were growing up was not available yet, right? Touch screens and things like that. But on the other hand, it is also about the paradigm shifts, right? The touch was one of these big shifts where it enabled access to computing to a much broader audience that we ever had before, right? With keyboards and mice or even more primitive input methods, there was a barrier to entry for certain group of people that they weren't able to use computers very effectively. Now everybody can with the touch phones. Well, almost everybody, maybe not as effectively as young kids, but we can all do something with the touch, even I. But that might not be the last barrier, right? We are obviously looking at continuous evolution. We have gesture-based controls now that are becoming more and more easy to use, even in portable scenarios. Or maybe the advent of the last year and a half of language models is showing us that actually we will be just talking to the machines in the future, and that will be much easier for everybody.
Yes.
But maybe that is a good way to look at, because we started this conversation around HMI and UX and so on and so on. I think the HMI layer has to work for every demographic group. Like, you have to interact with the machine effectively, even if you're like a young person or an old person. But as you go higher in the stack and you touch the experience level of it, currently the average age of a gamer is 36 years, and in Generation Z you have 82% of the people are playing games, mobile or console or whatsoever. So I think it has to be intuitively interacted with as on an HMI level, but then you have to provide experiences on top of that which you might use or you won't use depending on where you come from. But we definitely see also that demographic looks differently in APAC, like in Asia. That is still different, though we have also regional differences. But we see definitely a need for, let's say, to support this playful mind that is now awakening. When I was in college, I have to say, when you were a gamer, that was a pretty nerdy thing, right? And today, like my family, I just have conversations with my family to buy a Switch for next Christmas to play with my kids and our wife. So it's a social thing, more or less. So I think that changes that, maybe not the way how we interact with things. That is more changed by the Apples and the smartphone generation and so on and so on. But the expectation that what you have by playing a game, this reward system, and maybe collect points and that kind of thinking, or spend times in a playful manner, that is something which we might see reflected in a car.
Okay. That's a much more sophisticated sort of level of operation we're thinking in the past, but we're talking about next generation HMI experiences at this point. What about the real-time 3D game engine, Romano? I mean, we're looking at systems here now where we're verging away from thinking about a God's eye view navigation system that just gets me from point A to point B to something that's delivering a lot more than just helping me operate the motor vehicle.
I mean, so just to go back to that previous point. So it's not only the technology and the user experiences that change, right? It's also that society slowly adapts. So a lot of those things like gesture control and everything, these are learned behaviors. Like, for example, Apple invested a lot in marketing into ads to tell people that they can pinch on a touchscreen, and now people think it's intuitive. But if you never use that and you don't know how this works and you're just presented a touchscreen where you can do that, you probably will have a hard time figuring it out. So it's basically these two things converging, right? On the one side, we have technology and new ideas. On the other side, we have people that are slowly adapting to this new technology. And then in the end, that technology that we use as a base for this, like a game engine, that is a vehicle for that, right? It enables us to give that market what it needs. So some brands, for example, are kind of have like a more conservative customer base. So they would put like a little more simplistic user interface and a few more buttons and everything. And some other brands are very futuristic, and then they put like more touch screens and everything and make everything look a little more sci-fi. But in the end, you can do all of this, right? Like, just like you can make any game. You can make a tower defense game and a racing game and a cartoon style game and a near photorealistic game. So in the end, the technology is basically just there to support these companies building whatever is right for the market and for their customer base.
Yeah. Rock, I drove here through a nasty traffic jam, 8 lanes of traffic, and I relied on a system to tell me whether I should stay on the motorway or I should get off and take a side street. I notice now that that's not enough for motorists at this point. They want to know where the nearest coffee shop is. I mean, they want to know what the weather is going to be, 45 minutes from now. They want to know alternate possible routes, what lane they should be in. They want to know, amount of information which is surprising to people of my generation who look at that almost like an overload situation. But at what point do these systems stop becoming navigation systems and start becoming something else? Are we moving to a world now basically where we're looking for some kind of a personal assistant that sort of tells us, by the way, you need to pick up your dry cleaning, and we need that integrated into the navigation system? I mean, where are we going with this?
I mean, I think to some extent we already have a view of that, because there are certain vehicles out there that have Alexa integrated, and that literally is dubbed personal assistant. So experiments have been done in that direction. And if we look a little bit beyond that, we've recently had internal tests done where using a more sophisticated language model allows you to really have a conversation with such an assistant. And then it could be learning your behaviors and tell you, hey, by the way, you forgot to pick up your laundry on your way. You might want to take a turn here. And this is all within reach of technologies that are available today. It's really just about finding ways to put that in users' hands without technology getting in the way. Because as we talked about earlier, right, the experience, the quality of the experience is all about tech being there to solve problems, but not getting in the way. So if your assistant starts telling you, by the way, I saw your wife with a guy going to a hotel, that's probably not very useful information.
Well, I mean, you're right. Your humorous example that does bring up some interesting questions about things like privacy, about how much the systems in personal information are going to beam back. I would imagine that there are people that would be very interested to know where you purchase groceries, or what brand of gasoline that you prefer, basically. And that information, of course, is available in a connected sort of vehicle that sort of cloud or satellite connected. But all these things are adding layers. I mean, every time you talk about a feature, I'm thinking, well, there's 250,000 lines of code. there's a 500,000 lines of code at some point. So this thing can sort of grow exponentially, but you still have to deliver a product on time. Henning, from development tool perspective, I mean, how do you tackle this? Is this a matter of this? You plug the code in modules in a modular way? Are you just going to apply more engineers, more coders to the task, or are you going to have to automate some of these processes and lean on your development software to help?
Well, it's a part, I think, of everything you said, right? Modularizing is definitely a password. So what we see in modern architectures for HMI systems is that they modularize much more and reflecting an architecture which we see on smartphones, actually, right? To also enable over-the-air updates afterwards and actually more act like a host system for client applications to have to reflect this kind of app store thought and that kind of thing. A part of the heavy lifting of coding functions and features, obviously, is something we try to tackle as Unity, as a game engine. So you don't have to write a renderer which is performant on your device. You don't have to take care of a physics engine if you want to do stuff like that, or other functions and features which we encapsulate and offer as a part of our software tool. But I want to, like what you earlier said, is I think, there's also approach in saying, especially from the big ones, with Apple CarPlay and so on, and to basically go completely into car as a whole offering coming from, and we will also see this from Amazon and other big ones. I hope the future is more an API-based one, where you might use these services and you can still integrate them into and I remember that question came up earlier in this call. I think Paul had to answer it, about, is it like, should we give more power back to the car maker to integrate this instead of having complete modules where we come from? I believe with screens getting bigger and more actually in the screen, they have to embrace the idea of painting on this virtual canvas in their way and putting together an experience that you can have only inside a BMW or only in a Ford or a GM car or whatever. So the only way of liberating that is, one is the tool side where we come in, and the other one is maybe moving away from this black box, I give you this module, to a more API service SaaS based model, where you integrate service that might come from one of the big ones or from a smaller company, but you embed them in a user experience that you can have only inside that specific brand. I think if we don't, first of all, I think they miss a big chance if they don't do that. And second, me as a car enthusiast, and I think individual, I want to have something that is unique, and where I can say I love this brand because they do it in that way.
Well, that's interesting thought, interesting way to approach that. I'm also a car enthusiast, and a typical example would be Italian cars historically drive a little bit differently. They feel differently. They feel somehow, historically, enthusiast-driven, more so than perhaps Japanese cars. And that's a gross overgeneralization, of course, but historically, that's part of the brand experience. Or the brand experience of buying an Alfa Romeo compared to sort of buying a Ford historically was a notion of that it feels more optimized for someone that's interested in driving. Of course, that's not true across the entire brand, but it's a stereotype. A stereotype that's lasted for generations. Is the same thing going to be true of things like navigation systems, infotainment systems that serve the driver with information? Are OEMs going to be able to maintain brand identity that way? Because I imagine, say, a good navigation system, I want it to be functional, but I'm not sure that I really mind if it looks the same and feels the same in an Alfa Romeo than it does in a Toyota. Is there a need, you think, to try and create a brand identity within these systems too? Romana, how about you? What do you think? Paul? Yeah.
I definitely think so. So in a way, OEMs already do that. So if you look at the large OEMs that have multiple brands, they actually do variants where most of the infotainment, like software stack and hardware, is the same. And then you have like the luxury brand, and that has like some more buttons, and the design is a little like subdued, and then you have like the sporty brand that's basically the same car, but like all the buttons look like a little more toyish and everything, a little more aggressive. And then the HMI also is like more colorful and everything. So in a way, they already do this within the boundaries of what they can technically do, right? And this is where a game engine comes in to like push the boundaries. Because currently, if you look at like, let's say traditional infotainment frameworks, basically what designers can comfortably do is replacing some icons and changing some colors and fonts, right? But if we're looking at a game engine, like you have so much more options. You can change your animations. You can change the whole user experience and what you, for example, do with that map data. So, for example, your tech-focused brand could do something. You can zoom out like all the way from like the global view into your ADAS visualization. It shows you like your surrounding traffic and everything, and it could all be integrated. Currently, that's like with let's say traditional tech stacks where everything is silos, it's not really possible because the map rendering solution is a dedicated software that just renders its own, let's say, rectangle on the screen. And then you have another rectangle that is your climate controls, and they're all different frameworks. But if you put it all together, you can combine all this, like not just in a software architecture way, but in the user experience way. And then you could have the same stack and say for our more sporty brand, for our Italian sports cars, we're going to have a racetrack mode that actually shows you when you're on a racetrack and knows, and then it's going to show you all your turns, it's going to show you your lap timer and everything. So basically, it's still the same for the OEMs, as in they can work with the same tech stacks, but it gives designers more freedom to customize things for the individual brands that use those tech stacks and ultimately make these products more unique.
Yeah. Paul, you were going to jump in there.
No, I wanted to say almost exactly the same thing. It's the things we're exploring as well. We have scenic routes in our map data. That would be very interesting for indeed a car that is more like sporty. Especially when we know there's a route with a lot of winding curves in it, and maybe we want to then change the map a bit. Maybe we want to let you know, like, oh, you're kind of here on this track. Maybe transform the interface. Think about off-road driving. Maybe there's a certain start point. The map changed into a more a map view that helps you driving through that terrain. These are definitely things we'll look at and can elevate the brand experience and brand loyalty, which for I think a lot of customers is very important.
Paul or Rock, how much OEMs want a unique solution, or how much are they willing to buy something that's an overlay on top of a sort of a standardized solution?
Well, they're typically looking for unique branded solutions, right? Like how exactly you solve that for them, they don't particularly care as long as they get the experience they're looking for. But they really want to differentiate on this. And I was actually going to say this touches on what Romano said as well. The sophisticated game engines like Unity, they bring so much to the table here with opening up possibilities of what you can do. So maybe your interface and the map looks like Tron movie in one brand, but then you go to another vehicle that is maybe more trying to be something from the historical era, and it shows you like a paper map, and all of that is doable with the exact same technology stack, same data, with just tweaks the designers do. Most of it is at designer fingertips. Very little coding is involved to make these kind of changes.
To add to that, maybe is like even in the car itself, you have passenger displays, you have a cluster display, you have a center display. Probably all want a bit of a different map in those displays. You kind of want to maybe limit the amount of contextual information in the cluster, focus more on driving. But then for the passenger display, you don't want to maybe show that and show way more of the surrounding, like in restaurants in the area. So that is already in the car itself is much different.
Yeah. Henning, it's I'm imagining sort of a future world where the owner of a Mercedes S-Class who's touring, for example, has a system which recognizes the fact that the owner of the vehicle is actually touring and is significant distance away from their home, already knows what the particular food preferences are of that individual, and says, by the way, there's a 5-star sushi restaurant that's 3 kilometers ahead off this exit down here, and selects these things based on things that it already knows about the individuals in the vehicle. Perhaps it sounds crazy, this notion of this personalized stuff, but we think of these things as being cloud connected. Are these going to be things, do you think, that the developers are going to build into the systems in code, or are we going to have to use something that's cloud connected, basically, that radically updates the code, sort of by downloading this stuff almost in real time as these preferences change? I mean, can we imagine like a restaurant? My restaurant rating system is a simple example, but it's how would we do that? Is it something where it's going to be built into the tools?
Well, I think. Difficult question. So I think. To build that database and to collect that data and to basically create that persona of that passenger, I think you need data points I think there's no way without doing a cloud-based approach and just use the systems within the car to do that. So, but that leads to what I said earlier, to an API SaaS-based module, which might be that does not necessarily need to be a Google, Facebook, or whatever data collector API SaaS service. That could be something, in that case, Mercedes could offer in the future. I believe, like, to answer that a bit differently, I believe car makers have to at least consider the idea and have to play with the idea of becoming more like a mobility service provider in the future, instead of just selling cars, which is great. But I believe, like, if you take my son now, it just became 8, right? When he's in the age of commuting to work or doing that kind of things, for him, mobility will look differently. I'm not sure if he will ever buy a car, right? It's and if that Mercedes, in that case, they still want to own that kind of journey from A to B, or at least want to offer a kind of branded experience that brings you from A to B. I think that what you just described is a melange out of what they provide as with their cars and their autonomous fleet, maybe at that time, 5-10 years from now. A bit of services you get from third-party providers, maybe from the big ones, but maybe from other services. But that is embedded into a Mercedes branded experience, because maybe they have an exclusive contract with I'm saying Marvel or Avatar movie or whatever, or Star Wars or something. I'm a huge sci-fi fan. You might read this. So that you can only have that experience inside that specific brand. So that is I think the differentiation they should look into, at least long term, because it will be less about hardware and leather and metal and design. It will be more about the experience getting you from A to B. This is what I believe. And then what you just said is a part of that. I don't think all of that can be done in car, in code. I think it has to be a partner that needs to be cloud. Although we at Unity and others, but we at Unity are working on technology that you can even run neural networks on device without cloud connection, so to enable that. But as said, I think it will be a mixture.
Yeah. Rock, we were talking about that kind of future where we're going to be pipelining, prep cinematic films, perhaps, or games to these things. Some of that already does exist. Henning mentions self-driving vehicles, autonomous vehicles. We know from an engineering perspective that you can reduce the workload on the machine vision systems, the self-driving systems, dramatically if you have very high resolution understanding of the environment that the car is in. So the navigation system can certainly make it a lot easier for an autonomous vehicle to deal with its immediate surroundings. So that means higher resolution, error proofing, things that need to be updated on a regular basis to account for changes almost in real time. That would suggest that it has to be done as a service. There's no way to actually program that in just because of the amount the thing has to be updated. We know that BMW recently has attempted to charge heated seats as a service. I think they were trying on $6 a month or something for this, and there was some blowback. Some say this is the future, regardless. Do you think that you're looking at things such as the things that your firm develops at this point? Will that be rolled into, for example, a lease of a self-driving vehicle, or will we just basically all be driving taxis at this point? We won't even be aware of what the cost of the software as a service is in the background.
I mean, yeah, basically every vehicle project that we are currently working on has a form of this included in it, right? We are providing services because all our data ultimately comes through online services now. we're no longer doing projects where you just pre-install some data set on a device and you're done. Now everything is online first, and yeah, it will still keep working if you lose connection, but it is always going to keep updating itself when it reconnects. So yeah, in that sense, we are kind of already living that in a way. Is just going to continue expanding, because right now there are still some fairly strict limitations on the amount of bandwidth the vehicles are allowed to consume, and then OEMs have to make decisions around that. But I think as technology evolves, that will just get cheaper and cheaper and easier for them to upkeep. So to your point, I think, yeah, probably future is something that as a consumer, you want to really need to know about this. It will just kind of be there like on your mobile phone. Maybe if there is a future where nobody owns cars anymore, but it's all automated transport with certain brands, you will pay a subscription to a service, kind of like you buy a phone subscription today, but that will be it, right?
Yeah, yeah. Romano, if you're from a development perspective, if you're trying to add these functionalities which are coming from perhaps fourth-party vendors, at the same time, how do you expect that's going to work with the development tools? Would all be funneled through you, for example, hypothetically as the single tier one vendor to the OEM, or in the future, are developers for these things in this new gamified world? Are you going to be brokers of potentially individuals and firms around the world who are basically sort of beaming things into this funnel?
I mean, on the technical side, there are many ways to do this. So what I've seen a lot recently in the auto industry is the attempt to kind of put mobile apps and services into cars. And the problem with that is that, like, for example, a music streaming app or something that's made like for Android is not necessarily made for the car, right? And then you also see the user experience. It just looks like just put together quickly. Like you have your brand like skinned HMI, right? That looks very nice. And then they put an app in the middle of it, and then you change from like day to night mode, but the app doesn't respond, or it responds later because it's just like a different framework and everything. So there's this way to integrate things. And then there is what I think is the better way to actually give like third parties APIs that allow to actually add something to the user experience as it was designed for the car or for whatever embedded system, right? So an example is, let's say there is an app for like a fast food chain that shows you like all the deals around you and the restaurants. And then now if you just put that app on your screen, you would have to like with the first way, you would basically have to switch from your car navigation system to that app, and then the only thing you see is, well, that burger chain, right? And that's a terrible experience. You don't want to do that while driving. But if the car maker opens up an API for third parties to just add things to the map, right, and then add a layer to the map, and then the user can choose from all the layers that are available to them based on like what third-party services they subscribe to, then I think it can be integrated much better into the user experience. And then, of course, with Unity, it is possible to create APIs like this. In fact, like there's games, for example, like City Skylines, third parties can make mods for that game and add little buildings and everything to the city for players to play and place in there. And then the same way, third parties could pretty much create things that weren't originally part of the embedded system, like the car, but integrate really nicely into that experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Henning, you mentioned photorealism earlier in this conversation. We're starting to see that now in entertainment products, in games, even Hollywood films at this point, is that it's anecdotal that this requires vast amounts of computing power to achieve. Is this the future of HMIs for consumer goods like we're talking about? And do these development tools as they exist now, can they support that level of complexity, or are we going to need a new generation of development tools?
Well, I think we need a new generation of hardware, to be honest. But the development tools, if you look at our technology, but also those of other game engines, what you're saying, what is possible in real time to render on a typical game, PC, but also on a PlayStation, even the former generation PlayStation 4 or Xbox and so on. That is already pretty astonishingly, like, especially for me, like I said, I was a gamer in younger days. If I look back what I had on my Nintendo 64 or whatever, like today, that is pretty mind-blowing, right? So what you can do in photorealism on a typical game hardware is great. The question is, in terms of HMI, you know, we get this question pretty often because Unity is perceived as a 3D real-time engine. Although you can do fantastic 2D stuff with Unity. A lot of 2D games are out there made with Unity, super successful. So usually my answer is, like, the question is, does this everything has to be 3D now, and is that not distracting to the driver, and so on, right? So I believe current HMI, a modern design is still flat design, you know, pretty clean and so on and so on. This is still the zeitgeist of how things should look. And I think that won't change a lot. I think you still want to have a very clean image, but I think there's still beauty of letting this live in the how should I say, possible 3D space, to make this canvas. You paint this in 3D per se, so you can work with transitions. You can mix photorealistic or nearly photorealistic stuff with that flat design. It's not necessary that everything needs to be 3D. I think the contrast actually is the case, but I think we should give that freedom to the designer to say, let's explore how we can use this 3D space for our 2D elements, but also for 3D elements. Like what we see currently is those that embrace our technology or other game engines, the first thing they do is they make the car the star again. So you see the car as a 3D element to be in context with I don't know, vents and temperature and stuff, and then it zooms out and stuff like that. That is already a good usage of 3D to put the car into focus again. But we believe it should go way beyond that, right? It's not only about photorealism. It's also about to use the capabilities of having a procedural creation of things, what you can do in a game engine. Like today, you see a lot of pre-calculated animations or visuals. Why not using the sound input or other sensors to create a procedural visualization of something? And all of that. So to answer your question, it's not only about photorealism. I think you can achieve a great deal of that already today on today's hardware, and we're getting better and better day by day. So it's not a limitation on the tool side, it's more on the hardware side. But it's not only that aspect where a game engine can help with, but it's also what I just said.
Yeah.
Maybe if I can add to that, like what we see for, especially for the map, right? That's also something 3D, you know, and our users, it's kind of like understanding the map. If you can match it to reality, it's easier to read the map, right? And you don't need to fully recreate the world, because then there's a lot of noise in the world. So you kind of want to make it schematize that, right? But definitely a lot of things like need to be reflecting the real world, and I think that's also where these game engines play a nice role. You can use materials, maybe the same material as vegetation and you know, water, like it has the ripples there, so it's very clear, like, okay, that is water. Add trees to a park, so you make right away clear that's a park. So it's for us really like matching with reality on making the map understandable but still easy to read. That's kind of like that fine like point where we would like to be with our maps.
Yeah.
And to build on that, and we had this conversation earlier, I mean, it's a different thing for the driver, maybe compared to the people in the back. They still want to make use of that same map data, but in a more photorealistic way, maybe. So you can use the same foundational input, which is raw map data, but you have a different way of visualizing it in the rear compared to the back. And that is then changeable or customizable even, right? So
This is a simple example of this would be, right, we have services in addition to the raw map geometry. You have augmentations like satellite imagery and elevation data and a bunch of other things. And for the pure navigation use case, a driver might only care about the schematic view of the map, but the passenger might want to see the satellite cover and the elevation because, oh, I want to see where in the mountains we are going. And it's the same map data with a different visualization perspective, which is enabled by the underlying tech.
Gentlemen, there's so much to talk about. The tyranny of the clock is always in play. To wrap the conversation of the roundtable, can I ask a quick far-reaching question? 20 years from now, 25 years from now, will developers working in this space recognize things the same way we do now? Will from either the user experience or the developer experience, will HMIs look like they do now? Romano.
I don't think they will. I think we're going to move a lot from like the kind of static systems we have now into ecosystems. And visually, I think they're going to evolve. They're going to evolve slower than consumer electronics, but they have evolved already in the last 10 years. I don't think it's going to happen for the next 10, 20 years. And in the end, what you see in sci-fi movies right now, let's say conservative ones, we'll be able to see that in HMI cars in the future.
Paul, you agree?
Yeah. But I also would love to see the future, like HMIs become more human, right? So maybe not sci-fi, but just like, let's say a friend sitting next to you, like not there, but kind of like as if, and that has full contextual awareness. It knows exactly what to do. It's like virtual personal assistant, but not only talking about voice, it's also talking about augmented reality. So you just get all the information through whatever HMI that is, a screen, AR, voice, but in the right way. Especially that is important, like, when it's relevant, get that information only then. And also if you want to do something that the interface understands you. So make it just way more human. That would be my hope for the future as a designer.
Yeah. Henning, your future?
Well, plus 1,000 on what Paul just said, the contextual, like the in context, right? That is what we currently, or me personally, experience as still stupid tech. If I tell it, oh my God, you should know I'm having my appointment in half an hour. Why, that contextual is super important. If I need to add something, then maybe what we currently see happening on the AR XR side, I think the Vision Pro just released by Apple is a major leap into the right direction. It's still not where I want to see it to, but you asked 20 years from now, so that is a long time considering what happened just in the last year. So I think that kind of contextual, what Paul said, but also in context of an augmented reality approach, helping you on your daily life and making the mobility more enjoyable and more effective is potentially something we will see.
Yeah, Rock, 20 years?
Yeah, I'm gonna take what Henning said. I agree with everything he said, by the way, but I'm gonna go one step further, maybe just because let's spitball. But I do think this kind of AR augmentations will play a major role. Like you could imagine in a conservative scenario, it's something like an Iron Man helmet, but in a car, right? But to go one step beyond that, I would say maybe the whole cockpit becomes one giant screen or a perception of one anyway, where anything on context can change. Like if you're not driving, maybe the windows dim and everything becomes an entertainment center. When you're driving, you get all the context and it's all transparent around you. It's not just in front of you. Things like that.
Yeah, a remarkable future. From TomTom, Rock Erjavec, Paul Schouten. From Unity, Henning Lin, Romano McBride. Thank you all for joining me on the Engineering Roundtable. And thank you for watching. See you next time.